No form appeared to God's people in Exodus 20, and since no form appeared, that reveals something about who God is. What does it reveal? He's formless. If I may borrow from John's Gospel, God is spirit. And so worship has to conform to God's revelation of himself. How does he reveal of himself? He reveals himself apart from any reproducible image, so his people must make no image for worshiping him. Which, as you know, Exodus 32, we see that happening anyway. For the third commandment, go to verse 7. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. It is unclear across the board in scholarly circles what is meant precisely by taking the name of the Lord in vain. At the very least, there is this commonality. Okay? Since the name of the Lord, Yahweh, which is given earlier in Exodus, remember from Exodus chapter 3, I am that I am, here's my name. That indicates the revelation of God's character and his presence with his people. It's a revelation of who he is and his presence with his people. So the duty here is to protect the revelation of God's character, which is expressed in his name. Fourth, the fourth commandment begins in verse 8 and runs through verse 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle or sojourner who stays with you. For, here's why. In 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now you see this, that the demand for Sabbath observance sets forth the pattern of divine order. In 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and he rested. So, you must work and rest on Saturday. So, God's people replicate, by obeying this command, they replicate God's order of work and rest in creation by preserving this distinction between Saturday and all the other days of the week. The fifth commandment, as we move to the fifth commandment now, we are introduced to a decisive shift from what we could call Godward duties in commandments 1 through 4 to manward duties. Commandments 5 through 10 therefore express God's imposing of an order on the life of Israel as they relate to one another. Read verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. Here, God's order is expressed through a command to preserve the structure of the family and the orderly authority that it embodies. You disobey that commandment, and here's what happens. You impugn the author and sole originator of all authority, whose own parenthood is reflected in the fifth commandment. God's parenthood is reflected here. Not only order, but the preservation and continuation of life is implied in this commandment, in that the family is the only proper sphere for the continuation of Israel's life through offspring. God's dominion, therefore, is magnified when people are faithful to exercise dominion through being fruitful and multiplying in the context of the family. Sixth commandment is in verse 13. You shall not murder. Now, of course, the relationship of that commandment to life is very obvious. When you undermine life, when you take it from someone. More than that, murder is related to the divine life in that humanity has been made in God's image. And so, when you take a life, when you murder someone, you shake your fist at the God of life. It's an indirect attack on the God of all life. Our degradation into the disorder of death seriously disrupts the divine order. Seventh commandment sets forth orderliness in human sexuality. Look at verse 14. You shall not commit adultery. Now, as you know, committing adultery, like dishonoring parents, threatens the life and the order that the family is meant to embody. It disrupts family life. And since human sexuality is predominantly connected with procreation in Scripture, life is threatened by a failure to comply with this demand. Faithful marriage, then, is a reflection. How does it reflect God? That's what we're saying about these commandments, that they reflect God. How does it reflect God? It reflects God's commitment to his people, his faithfulness. Adultery disorders the relations of human sexuality as a reflection of God's faithfulness to his people. It makes God look bad. Look to verse 15 for the 8th commandment. You shall not steal. Human ownership is a reflection of the dominion of God over all creation. God owns everything. He owns everything, and his ownership is a product of his work of bringing order in life from chaos and nothingness. So what theft does is it disorders the relations of human ownership as they were meant to reflect God's rule over the world. The 9th commandment is verse 16. Notice what it says. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. What is God demanding here? Orderliness in speech. And lying subverts that order. As we notice in Genesis 1, speech originates with God, and what is it used by him to do? To bring order in life, not to bring chaos and death. And then from there, the Lord gives speech to humanity, through which Adam brings order to the creation. How does he do it? Through naming, through classifying, if you will, the animals during his quest for a helper suitable for them. Truthful speech, the opposite of bearing false witness, imitates the truthfulness and the orderliness of God, who is himself cosmic order and cosmic truth. And then finally, the Lord enjoins orderliness in our human desires by condemning coveting. Notice verse 17. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now, the verb from which we get the word covet means to desire, to yearn for, to lust after something or someone for your own use and gratification. But that's not all. It often includes the nuance of having designs on a given object and therefore scheming and maneuvering to get it. So we might translate the commandment like this. You shall not scheme to acquire your neighbor's household. And if that's so, that's the nuance that's present here, and I think it's likely. Then the Lord is condemning not the desire for objects per se, but the evil manipulations and machinations that accompany that desire. Contentment with our possessions is a reflection of our satisfaction with God's goodness and love. So, whether I posture myself with my neighbor to acquire his wife or his servants, or I posture myself to obtain his animals or other possessions, my neighbor becomes an obstacle to me. Rather than a brother, he becomes an obstacle, and the good gifts of God's provisions, which flow from his own goodness, become an occasion for indulgence. So, when we treat neighbor with contempt by coveting what belongs to him, we seriously undermine our ability to reflect God's goodness and his love. We don't love that person, he is an obstacle, and we do not understand goodness, because rather than seeing the things which he has as God's good gifts, we desire them to fulfill our lustful pleasures. So, what do we learn from these 10 commandments? Well, the 10 commandments represent the stipulations for life under the rule of Israel's king, this life giver and king. And God gives them not simply as a code of behavior, but as a reflection of his character as the king of the universe, who manifests through them order and life that find their origin in him. 10 Commandments, therefore, are a window into the character of God. And more than that, and something that I've only intimated in our walk through the Decalogue, is this. By framing his own order in life in terms of an ancient Near Eastern treaty, the Lord places the experience of order in life in the hands of his people. Here's what I mean. Obedience results in life. Disobedience